November 4th, 1944. 1925 hours. The sky above Bon Angelar airfield is crowded. Squadron Leader Branse Burbridge throttles back his twin Merlin engines, forcing his agile de Havilland Mosquito to slow to the lethargic 160 knots of the landing traffic. He isn't hunting the enemy, he is joining them. To his left, barely 500 yards away in the pitch black, is the silhouette of a Junkers 88 night fighter. Behind him, a Messerschmitt 110. Above and below, the Luftwaffe's deadliest aces are stacking up in a standard orbital landing pattern, gear down, flaps extended, waiting for tower clearance. Burbridge and his radar operator, Bill Skelton, are quite literally the wolf in the fold. They are hiding in the blind spot of the entire German air defense network, banking their wooden aircraft in perfect synchronization with the Nazis they came to kill. The tension in the cockpit is absolute. One slip in airspeed, one errant radio signal, or a single flash of exhaust flame, and the 6 enemy aircraft surrounding them will turn this landing circuit into a firing squad. But the most dangerous man in this formation isn't the German aces. It's the mild-mannered conscientious objector sitting in the British cockpit, about to trigger the most ruthless ambush in the history of electronic warfare. To understand how a pacifist ended up hunting wolves in the dark, we have to go back to the moment the RAF realized they were losing a war they couldn't even see. By late 1943, that blindness had become catastrophic. Bomber Command's offensive against the Third Reich wasn't just stalling, it was being dissected, piece by piece, in the black void over Germany. The crews of the Avro Lancasters and Handley Page Halifaxes called it the Reaper's Shadow, but the technical term was the Kammhuber line, a sophisticated, layered defense network that had turned the night sky into a mathematically precise kill box. For the first few years of the war, the night offered safety. The darkness was a cloak that hid the slow, heavy bombers from the swift, predatory fighters. But German engineering had stripped that cloak away. By 1944, the Luftwaffe had achieved something terrifying: technological transparency. They didn't need the sun to see the RAF. They had the Lichtenstein SN-2. If you looked at the nose of a Junkers 88 or a Messerschmitt 110 from this period, you would see a bizarre array of metal piping jutting out like the antlers of a stag. This was the Matratza or mattress antenna array for the SN-2 radar system. While the British were relying on jamming techniques like window, strips of aluminum foil dropped to confuse earlier radar sets the Germans had adapted. The SN-2 operated on a lower frequency band, around 90 megahertzes, drifting below the clutter of British jamming. High above the Ruhr Valley, inside the cramping cockpit of a Ju-88, a German radar operator stared into a small cathode ray tube. He wasn't looking for a visual shape. He was hunting for a blip, a spike of electronic light that betrayed the position of a British bomber up to 4 miles away. The moment that blip appeared, the cat-and-mouse game was over. The German pilot didn't have to search. He simply followed the electronic breadcrumbs straight to the target. But locating the bomber was only half the equation. The true genius of the German counteroffensive lay in how they killed. For years, the standard doctrine of aerial combat was the dogfight, get behind the enemy and fire forward. But attacking a Lancaster from the rear was suicide. The British bombers were bristling with hydraulic turrets. The tail end Charlie, the rear gunner, scanned the darkness with paranoid intensity, his 4 303 Browning machine guns, ready to shred anything that approached from the 6 o'clock position. The Luftwaffe realized that the Lancaster had a fatal flaw, a blind spot that no amount of crew training could fix: the belly. There was no ventral turret. The bomber was completely defenseless from below. To exploit this, German engineers developed a weapon system so unorthodox that it was codenamed Schräge Musik, literally slanted music or jazz music, a reference to its strange, offbeat nature. Mechanics tore into the fuselages of their night fighters, installing twin 20mm MG 151 cannons behind the pilot's cockpit. But instead of pointing forward, these guns were mounted at a steep upward angle, typically between 65 and 70 degrees. The pilot was given a separate gun sight, often mounted on the canopy roof, looking upwards. The tactics were surgical. Guided by the Lichtenstein radar, the German ace would approach the British bomber stream from below, matching the bomber's speed and heading. He would slide his fighter into the black void underneath the Lancaster's fuselage, sometimes as close as 50 or 100 yards. The British crew above had no idea they were already dead. The tail gunner was looking back. The mid-upper gunner was scanning the horizon. The bombardier was looking down at the target city through his bomb sight. No one was looking directly underneath the aircraft. The German pilot would drift effortlessly into position, aligning his upward-firing cannons with the fuel tanks located in the Lancaster's massive wing roots. He didn't use tracer ammunition. Tracers would give away his position. He used a mix of high-explosive and incendiary rounds, the Minengeschoss, mine shells, designed to blow massive holes in aluminum skin. When he pulled the trigger, he didn't bank away or dive. He simply drifted underneath the bomber while his cannons sawed through the wing spars above him. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. For the British crews, there was no warning, no tracer fire zipping past, no engine noise from an attacker. 1 second, they were flying straight and level. The next, the starboard wing root would erupt in a white-hot magnesium fire. The fuel tanks would detonate, shearing the wing off completely. Thousands of airmen died believing they had been hit by heavy flak. The RAF command was so baffled by the sudden, violent explosions of their aircraft that they initially blamed scarecrow shells, a mythical German anti-aircraft round designed to simulate an exploding bomber to terrify the other crews. They couldn't accept, or perhaps couldn't understand, that the enemy was literally flying in their shadow. This was the invisible noose. The Lichtenstein radar allowed the Germans to find the bombers in the infinite dark, and the Schräge Musik allowed them to kill without ever being seen. The attrition rates skyrocketed. In one single night during the Nuremberg raid in March 1944, Bomber Command lost 96 aircraft, more men than were lost in the entire Battle of Britain. The message was written in burning aluminum across the German countryside. The bomber will not always get through. Not anymore. The RAF needed a solution, but you cannot fight a ghost with a sledgehammer. They needed a hunter that could enter the dark, see the invisible beams of the Lichtenstein radar, and turn the hunters into the hunted. They needed a technological heresy. That heresy was born in the frozen Nissen huts of RAF Swanington, under the banner of the newly formed No. 100 Group. This wasn't a typical bomber squadron. They were the Spooks, a clandestine collection of scientists, hackers, and elite crews dedicated to the dark art of electronic warfare. While the rest of the RAF tried to bludgeon the Luftwaffe with high explosives, 100 Group decided to dismantle them with physics. Their breakthrough wasn't a new cannon or a faster engine. It was a small, unassuming black box codenamed Serrate. The logic behind Serrate was a masterclass in electronic Judo, the martial art of using an opponent's strength to destroy him. British intelligence knew the German Lichtenstein radars were flooding the sky with radio pulses to find the bombers. A traditional countermeasure would be to jam those signals, to scream noise into the German receivers, to blind them. But jamming tells the enemy you are there. It alerts them to danger. The architects of 100 Group asked a different question. What if we let them keep their radar on? What if we use their own search beams as a lighthouse to guide us straight to their throat? Serrate was a passive homing receiver. It didn't emit a single signal. It simply listened. When a German night fighter turned on its Lichtenstein SN-2 radar to hunt a Lancaster, it was unknowingly broadcasting a homing beacon to every Serrate-equipped mosquito in the sector. On the cathode ray tube in the British cockpit, the German radar pulse didn't look like a dot. It looked like a herringbone or fishbone pattern of light. The longer the bone, the closer the enemy. It transformed the air war instantly. The German ace thought he was the hunter turning on his flashlight in a dark room to find prey. He didn't realize that in the corner of that room, a silent assassin was watching the beam, following it back to the hand that held the light. But a weapon this subtle required a pilot with a rare temperament. It required patience, intellect, and a cold, detached precision. It required Branse Burbridge. Burbridge was the ultimate paradox of the air war. In 1941, as the world burned, he had registered as a conscientious objector. He was a devout Christian, a man who read scripture daily and held a deep moral aversion to violence. He had intended to serve in the medical corps, to heal rather than harm. But as the reports of Nazi atrocities mounted, and the Blitz leveled British cities, Burbridge faced a crisis of faith. He realized that pacifism in the face of absolute tyranny was not holiness, it was complicity. He joined the RAF, but he brought his conscience into the cockpit with him. He wasn't a knight of the air looking for glory. He was a surgical instrument. He viewed the German night fighter force not as men to be hated, but as a mechanical system that had to be dismantled to stop the slaughter of the bomber crews. Paired with Flight Lieutenant Bill Skelton, a brilliant navigator who could interpret the dancing green phosphors of the radar screens like sheet music, Burbridge developed a fighting style that was terrifyingly efficient. They didn't fly with the aggression of the fighter pilot. They flew with the calculation of the engineer. Skelton would stare into the rubber eyepiece of the radar scope, his face bathed in the green glow. "Contact," he would say, his voice flat over the intercom. "Starboard, range 3 miles. He's painting us." That was the cue. The German was sweeping the sky with his radar, looking for a victim. Skelton would guide Burbridge down the invisible beam. "Left 2 degrees, signal strengthening. He's looking right at us, skip." Burbridge would ease the wooden Mosquito into the slipstream of the German fighter. He wouldn't fire immediately. He would close the distance until the dark shape of the Ju-88 or Bf-110 filled his windscreen. He wanted to be close enough to see the exhaust flames flickering from the enemy's manifolds. And here, the conscientious objector applied his own grim morality. Burbridge's philosophy was, aim for the engines. He told himself, and he told Skelton, that he wanted to destroy the machine and give the crew a chance to bail out. It was a noble, almost naive rationalization. In reality, hitting the wing root of a frantic aircraft laden with high-octane aviation fuel, with 20mm high-explosive shells, usually resulted in a catastrophic fireball. But this mental separation targeting the mechanism, rather than the man, allowed Burbridge to operate with a steady hand that other pilots couldn't match. He wasn't killing, he was deactivating a threat. By late 1944, this partnership of the pacifist and the professor had turned 85 Squadron into the Luftwaffe's worst nightmare. But the Germans were not static targets. They were veterans, survivors of 4 years of war, and they began to realize that their greatest weapon, their radar, had become a death sentence. So, the Luftwaffe adapted. They did the one thing that could defeat the Serrate system. They turned their radars off. And suddenly, the electronic Judo stopped working. The British hunters were left staring at blank screens, flying blind in the hostile dark, while the German wolves moved silently, visually, invisible once again. To catch them now, Burbridge would have to do something suicidal. He would have to stop hunting them in the sky and start hunting them where they slept. But silence, in the high-stakes geometry of night fighting, is a double-edged sword. By extinguishing their Lichtenstein radars to hide from Burbridge, the German crews were effectively blinding themselves. They were solving one problem, survival, by creating another, irrelevance. A night fighter that cannot see in the dark is useless. Without their radar pulses to guide them to the British bomber streams, the Luftwaffe aces were reduced to stumbling around the sky, hoping to catch a visual glimpse of a Lancaster against the moon. For Bomber Command, this soft kill, neutralizing the enemy by forcing them into passivity, was a victory. But for Squadron Leader Branse Burbridge, staring out into the empty blackness over the Ruhr Valley, it was a tactical frustration. The herringbone signals on Skelton's scope had vanished. The digital ocean had gone quiet. This phenomenon was so widespread it earned a grim nickname among the German crews, Mosquito Schreck, or Mosquito Terror. The mere rumor that a 100-group intruder was in the sector was enough to ground entire Geschwader. The psychological paralysis was total. Luftwaffe ground controllers would scream into their microphones, ordering aces to power up their sets and engage the bomber stream, only to be met with defiance. The German pilots knew that the moment they flipped the switch on the SN-2, they were lighting a flare in a dark forest, inviting the wooden executioner to come for them. So, the game changed. The passive hunt waiting for the enemy to speak was over. Burbridge and Skelton had to switch to the active hunt. To do this, they relied on the other piece of classified technology packed into the Mosquito's nose, the AIMKX radar. Unlike the passive Serrate, which listened, the Mark X was a brute force American instrument, known in the U.S. Army Air Forces as the SCR-720. It fired a high-energy centimetric pulse that could punch through clouds and even the German window jamming strips. Inside the Mosquito's nose radome, a dish antenna spun frantically, spiraling its beam to create a cone of detection ahead of the aircraft. But using the Mark X was like searching for a needle in a haystack with a penlight, whereas Serrate had been like seeing the needle glow in the dark. The field of view was narrow. Skelton had to work the knobs furiously, tilting the dish up and down, trying to sweep the immense volume of empty sky for a solid contact. For hours, they would patrol the emptiness. The strain on the eyes and the mind was exhausting. The drone of the Merlins, the vibration of the airframe, and the hypnotic green sweep of the radar trace induced a trance-like fatigue. "Nothing, Skip. Scope is clear," Skelton would mutter, wiping sweat from his eyes. They were burning fuel, burning time, and the bombers were dying somewhere else, out of reach. Burbridge realized that if the enemy wouldn't come to him, he had to go to the one place they couldn't avoid. The one place where every pilot, no matter how skilled or paranoid, is vulnerable. Home. Every aircraft must land. And to land at night, in a high-performance fighter like a Ju-88, requires a rigid, predictable set of behaviors. You have to slow down. You have to lower your landing gear, which ruins your aerodynamics. You have to extend your flaps, which kills your maneuverability. And most fatally, you have to fly a precise pattern around the airfield to line up with the runway lights. The Germans had turned off their airborne radars, but they couldn't turn off their airfields. Burbridge pushed the control column forward, diving the Mosquito away from the high-altitude patrol lines and down into the murky, flak-infested air near the ground. He turned the nose toward the coordinates of Bonn Handler, a major Luftwaffe night fighter base south of Cologne. This was the new doctrine of 100 Group, intruder operations. It was the most dangerous flying of the war. To hunt a fighter at 20,000 feet is combat. To hunt him in his own landing circuit is assassination. It meant flying deep into the heart of the enemy's flak defenses, where every gunner on the ground was itchy and waiting for a target. As they approached the Rhine, the landscape below changed. The total blackout of the countryside gave way to the faint, scattered gleam of the airfield's navigational beacons. The Germans were confident here. They believed the Mosquito terror lived in the upper atmosphere, not on their doorstep. Skelton's voice crackled, cutting through the static. "Contact. Multiple contacts. Low. They're swarming, Skip." The AI MKX screen, previously empty, suddenly lit up with a clutter of blips. The German night fighter force wasn't hiding anymore. They were returning from their sorties, tired, low on fuel, and desperate to get on the ground. They were stacking up in a landing orbit, circling the airfield like moths around a porch light. Burbridge checked his fuel gauges. He checked his gun sight. He didn't bank away to set up a high-speed slash attack. He did the unthinkable. He throttled back. He dropped his speed to match the sluggish pace of the heavy German fighters. He wasn't going to attack the formation. He was going to join it. The descent toward Bonn Handler began with a masterclass in interception. Before Burbridge could slip into that wolf pack circling the airfield, he had to carve a path through the sentries guarding the approach. At 19:04 hours, Skelton's serrate screen flickered. A single, distinct herringbone pulse. A Junkers 88 was prowling 4 miles to the east, its Lichtenstein radar sweeping the dark for British bombers. Burbridge didn't hesitate. He swung the Mosquito behind the German, closing the distance at 280 knots. This was the discipline of the surgical strike. The Mosquito carried 4 20mm Hispano cannons in its belly, fed by drum magazines holding roughly 175 rounds per gun. In a chaotic dogfight, a panicked pilot could empty those drums in 10 seconds of spray and pray fire. Burbridge didn't have that luxury. He was deep in enemy airspace, miles from home, with a target-rich environment. He treated his ammunition triggers like the shutter of a camera short, precise exposures. He closed to 1,000 feet. Then 500. He waited until the silhouette of the Ju-88 filled the glowing ring of his gun sight, until he could see the exhaust stacks glowing cherry red against the black fuselage. "Aim for the engines," he whispered. He pressed the fire button for exactly 3 seconds. The physics of a 20mm high-explosive incendiary, HEI, shell are unforgiving. Burbridge's Mercy aimed at the engine, but at 300 knots, the dispersion of 4 cannons creates a shotgun effect. The shells slammed into the Junker's port wing root the junction, where the engine meets the fuselage, and critically, where the main fuel lines run. There was no cinematic dogfight. The Junkers simply disintegrated. The wing sheared off in a violent bloom of orange magnesium fire, sending the German crew spinning into the earth below. 19:06 hours. 1 down. 11 minutes later, Skelton isolated a second target, another Ju-88, this one flying silent, radar off. But the Mosquito's active AI MKX punched through the dark and found him. Burbridge repeated the ritual. Close to 400 feet. Align the sight. 3 seconds of fire. The second German fighter dissolved in a fireball near the Rhine. 2 kills, 20 minutes. But the main event was still ahead. At 1923, they reached the Bonn-Handler airfield. Below them, the ground was a nervous patchwork of flak batteries and runway lights. Above them was the orbit, the landing circuit Burbridge had decided to infiltrate. He throttled back, bleeding airspeed to match the lumbering 160 knots of the landing pattern. The Mosquito slid into the queue, sandwiched between 2 German heavy fighters. To the German ground controllers, the radar blip looked just like another tired Nachtjagd crew coming home for schnapps and sleep. Skelton called out the ranges in a whisper. 1 ahead, 500 yards. 1 behind, 800 yards. Steady, skip. Burbridge focused on the aircraft in front of him, a Messerschmitt Bf 110, the twin-tail workhorse of the German night force. The German pilot was flying a perfect approach, flaps down, gear locking into place, completely unaware that the shadow trailing him wasn't a wingman. This was the wolf in the fold moment. Burbridge crept closer, ignoring the screaming instinct that said he was too slow, too low, too vulnerable. At 400 feet, the Bf 110's twin rudders framed his sight. The German was so close Burbridge could see the pilot's head moving in the cockpit. He fired. The sound of the cannons was deafening in the quiet landing circuit. The Messerschmitt didn't just crash, it evaporated. The fuel tanks, fully exposed in the landing configuration, detonated instantly. The burning wreckage tumbled out of the sky, raining debris onto the very runway it was trying to land on. Chaos erupted. The airfield lights were doused instantly. The orbit broke. German pilots, suddenly realizing there was a killer inside the pattern, scattered in every direction. The orderly line became a frantic scramble of banking wings and panicked radio calls. "Break left, Skip, contact coming round," Skelton yelled. A 4th German fighter, a Ju-88 G1, had seen the explosion and turned hard, looking for the intruder. He wasn't running, he was engaging. Burbridge hauled the Mosquito into a tight turn, pulling G's that made the wooden airframe groan. He found himself nose to nose with the vengeful German. This was the nightmare scenario. A head-on pass at a combined closure rate of 600 miles per hour. There is no tactic here, only nerve. Both aircraft are flying straight down each other's gun barrels. The first pilot to flinch lives. The first pilot to fire wins. The German fired first. Tracer rounds whipped past the Mosquito's canopy, green streaks of light missing by inches. Burbridge didn't flinch. He held his line, waiting for the split second where the geometry was absolute. He dumped everything he had left. A 5-second burst. The 4 Hispanos hammered a solid wall of steel into the nose of the oncoming junkers. The German cockpit glass shattered. The shells traveled the length of the fuselage, ripping the aircraft apart from the inside out. The Ju-88 pitched up violently, rolled inverted, and plunged into the darkness, burning. 1940 hours. 4 German night fighters destroyed in 36 minutes. Burbridge leveled out, his heart hammering against his ribs. The magazines were empty. The sky behind them was lit by 4 separate pyres, burning on the German countryside. He turned the Mosquito northwest, toward home. He had expended roughly 600 rounds of ammunition to dismantle a squadron. He had proven that the invisible hunter wasn't just a myth, it was the deadliest reality the Luftwaffe had ever faced. But as the adrenaline faded, the grim mathematics of what he had just done began to settle in. He hadn't just won a fight. He had changed the economic model of the air war. That economic model became clear the moment the wheels of the Mosquito kissed the tarmac at RAF Swanington. It was 20-32 hours. They had been airborne for nearly 3 hours, traversing the most heavily defended airspace on Earth, yet the wooden airframe didn't have a single scratch. As Burbridge cut the Merlin engines, the silence that flooded the cockpit was heavier than the roar had been. The ground crew swarmed the aircraft, expecting the usual report, a quiet patrol, maybe a fleeting contact. Instead, they saw Burbridge and Skelton climb down, their faces pale, drained of adrenaline, holding up 4 fingers. Inside the debriefing hut, the intelligence officer stared at the combat report with a mix of skepticism and awe. In the sterilized light of the office, the violence of the last hour was reduced to neat columns of ink. Time, location, aircraft, type, result. 4, the officer muttered, tapping the paper. In one sortie, it was unheard of. Most night fighter crews flew entire tours of 30 operations without ever seeing an enemy aircraft. To destroy 4 in a single night was statistically aberrant. But the gun camera film would later confirm the impossible: 4 distinct pyres burning on the German landscape. For the RAF High Command, this was a tactical triumph. But for Branse Burbridge, the man who had once refused to wear a uniform because it meant taking a life, it was a moral reckoning. This is where the mathematics of mercy came into play. Burbridge knew the men he had just killed were not nameless infantrymen. They were the Experten, the elite pilots and radar operators of the Nachtjagd. Training a night fighter crew took years. It required a level of technical mastery that couldn't be replaced by conscripts. Every pilot Burbridge shot down wasn't just a casualty. He was a strategic asset removed from the board. In the quiet of the debrief room, the equation balanced itself. A single German night fighter ace averaged roughly 6 bomber kills per year. Some, like Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, claimed over 120. By destroying 4 of these predators in 40 minutes, Burbridge and Skelton hadn't just removed 4 planes. They had mathematically guaranteed the survival of perhaps 20 or 30 RAF bombers. That meant 140 to 200 airmen, fathers, brothers, sons, would fly home that month because the hunters waiting for them were dead. "I tried to aim for the engines," Burbridge would often say when pressed about the violence. "To stop the machine, not the man." Whether that was ballistically true or a necessary psychological shield for a gentle man doing a brutal job, the result was undeniable. The intruder tactic was vindicated. The data from November 1944 proved it. In October, before the intensified Suicidal operations, Bomber Command had lost 217 heavy bombers to German night fighters. It was a massacre. But in November, as Burbridge and 100 Group turned the hunters into the hunted, that number dropped to 152. The Luftwaffe's kill rate plummeted by nearly 30%. The mosquito terror had worked. By taking the fight to the enemy's airfields, by exploiting the very radar they used to see, the RAF had forced the Germans into a defensive crouch. Burbridge didn't know it yet, but he had just flown the defining mission of his life. He would go on to end the war with 21 confirmed kills, making him the highest-scoring RAF night fighter ace of the conflict. But the true legacy of that night wasn't the medals or the records. It was the proof that in the age of electronic warfare, the most dangerous weapon wasn't the plane that flew the fastest, it was the pilot who could see the invisible. Yet, as the war wound down, the technology that Burbridge had mastered, the radar homing, the electronic detection, didn't disappear. It was about to evolve into something far more terrifying. The wooden mosquito was destined for the scrap heap, but the idea of the wild weasel, the aircraft that hunts radar, was just being born. That idea didn't die with the Third Reich. It migrated, mutated, and became the foundation of modern air superiority. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, the wooden mosquitoes were parked on dispersal strips, left to rot or be broken up for matchwood. But the serrate concept, the principle of hunting a weapon system by tracking its own electronic voice, was carefully extracted by Allied intelligence and locked away in the deepest vaults of military doctrine. 20 years later, over the steaming jungles of North Vietnam, that doctrine was violently resurrected. American pilots found themselves facing a new version of the Kammhuber line, the Soviet-built SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missile. Just like the German night fighters, the SA-2 relied on a radar beam, the fan song, to lock onto its target. And just like Bomber Command in 1944, the U.S. Air Force was bleeding. The solution was a direct lineage to Branse Burbridge's cockpit. The Pentagon created a new breed of hunter-killer teams codenamed Wild Weasels. Flying Phone 100 Seconds, F-105 Thunder Chiefs, and later F-4 Phantoms, these pilots would deliberately fly into the kill zone, waiting for the enemy radar to light them up. The technology had advanced. Cathode ray tubes were replaced by radar homing and warning dot gear, and the 20mm cannons were supplemented by the AGM-45 Schräge missile, but the physics remained identical. The Schräge missile was essentially a robotic Branse Burbridge. It didn't need to see the missile site. It simply sniffed the radar beam and wrote it down to the source, detonating the transmitter. Today, this mission is called SEAD suppression of enemy air defenses. If you look at a modern F-35 Lightning II, its primary survival mechanism isn't just speed or stealth. It is a suite of passive sensors that suck in the electromagnetic spectrum, identifying enemy radars from hundreds of miles away. Every time a modern pilot destroys a SAM site using an anti-radiation missile, they are walking in the footsteps of a pacifist who flew a wooden plane over the Rhine. But while the world's air forces spent decades perfecting his method of killing, Branse Burbridge spent the rest of his life perfecting the art of peace. The moment the war in Europe ended, the invisible hunter walked away. He didn't stay in the RAF to become a general. He didn't write memoirs glorifying his kills. He declined offers to become a test pilot for the new jet age. The man who had mastered the violence of the night felt that his debt to his conscience was paid, but his work for his God was just beginning. He traded his flight suit for a scholar's gown, entering Oxford University to study history and theology. He was ordained as a minister, dedicating his life to the Scripture Union, a Christian organization focused on youth work. For the next 40 years, the hands that had fired the cannons that disintegrated 21 German aircraft held nothing deadlier than a Bible. He rarely spoke of the war. To the thousands of young students he mentored, he wasn't the ace of aces or the mosquito terror. He was just Branse, the quiet, gentle man who spoke about forgiveness. When pressed by historians or enthusiasts who tracked him down, he would politely deflect the glory. He refused to frame the conflict as a great adventure. To him, it was a tragedy that he had been forced to participate in, a necessary evil to stop a greater darkness. There is a profound irony in his legacy. The world remembers him as a destroyer, a man who perfected the active hunt. But Burbridge defined himself by what he saved. He didn't count the German planes he shot down. He counted the bomber crews he kept alive. In his final years, struggling with the frailty of age, his family made a discovery that perfectly encapsulated his character. His medals, the Distinguished Service Order with Bar, the Distinguished Flying Cross with Bar, were among the most prestigious decorations in the British Empire. Collectors would have paid a fortune for them. Museums would have enshrined them. Burbridge had sold them. He hadn't sold them for profit or because he was ashamed. He sold them to pay for his nursing care, so he wouldn't be a burden to his family. The symbols of his war were traded to sustain his peace. It was the final act of a practical man who understood that medal, whether it is a medal on a chest or a radar antenna on a Junkers 88, is ultimately just material. What matters is the human life behind it. Branse Burbridge died in 2016, at the age of 95. He left behind a tactical legacy that protects every pilot flying in hostile airspace today, and a moral legacy that challenges us to ask not just how we fight, but why. He proved that you can be a master of war without losing your humanity. He proved that sometimes the most effective weapon is the one that refuses to be seen. And he taught us that even in the darkest skies, when the whole world seems to be burning, a single light or a single radar pulse can change the course of history. History often remembers the noise of war, the roar of the engines, the thunder of the flak, the scream of the falling bombs. But the true victory of Branse Burbridge and the ghost squadrons of No. 100 Group wasn't found in the noise. It was found in the silence they created. By January 1945, that silence had descended over the great night fighter bases of the Third Reich. The airfields at Bonn-Hangelaar, Gütersloh, and Dortmund, once hives of lethal activity, had become places of paralyzing paranoia. The Nachtjagd crews, the men who had ruthlessly dismantled the RAF bomber streams for 3 years, were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted. They sat in their dispersal huts, fully fueled and armed, listening to the drone of British engines overhead, too terrified to take off. They knew that somewhere in the black void above, a wooden mosquito was circling, its passive receivers listening for the faintest electronic whisper. This was the ultimate vindication of the electronic Judo doctrine. The Luftwaffe had built the most sophisticated air defense network in history, a technological marvel of radar belts and ground control intercepts. But Burbridge and Skelton had proven that this very sophistication was its Achilles heel. By turning the enemy's sensors against them, they hadn't just defeated a few squadrons, they had rendered the entire German strategy obsolete. The Kammhuber line hadn't been smashed by brute force, it had been dismantled by intellect. The psychological impact was devastating. German records captured after the war revealed that the mosquito terror caused a collapse in morale far greater than the actual physical losses. A pilot who fears his own radar is a pilot who cannot fight. And a night fighter force that cannot fight is simply a collection of expensive scrap metal. In the final accounting, the numbers tell a stark story. The 100 Group intruders destroyed 258 German aircraft. It seems a small number compared to the thousands of bombers lost. But military history is not a game of arithmetic, it is a game of leverage. Those 258 aircraft were the apex predators. By removing them and by terrifying the rest into passivity, the intruders saved an estimated 1,200 heavy bombers in the final 6 months of the war. That is 10,000 airmen, 10,000 fathers, brothers, and sons who walked off their transport ships in 1945 because Branse Burbridge was waiting in the dark to clear their path. Burbridge's war ended not with a bang, but with a quiet return to the ethics he had never truly abandoned. He walked away from the cockpit and the carnage without looking back, leaving the invisible hunter behind to become a shepherd of men's souls. But the lesson he left us is timeless. It reminds us that in the face of an overwhelming, technically superior enemy, the answer is rarely found in trying to be stronger or faster. It is found in looking at the problem through a different lens, in finding the hidden frequency, the stupid solution, the fatal flaw that turns the giant's strength into his downfall. However, the war against the Axis wasn't just being fought in the electronic spectrum over Germany. While Burbridge was using radar to master the dark, halfway across the world, another pilot was trying to solve an even more impossible problem: how to sink a ship without torpedoes, without dive brakes, and without radar, using a technique that defied the laws of physics. That is the story of the dam busters of the Pacific, and the man who turned a B-25 bomber into a skipping stone. If you found this analysis valuable, and you want to see us deconstruct that impossible engineering feat next, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue to excavate these untold histories. Leave a comment below if you think the electronic judo tactic would work in modern warfare. Until the next briefing, dismiss.